I started working on this sermon yesterday morning when I got up, like I usually do on Saturdays, and then Shelley started having some issues with her stomach, where she said it started feeling like she had these stabbing pains, and it didn't want to go away, and so I stopped, closed my laptop, and I took her to urgent care, and she went in while I stayed out in the truck with the kids, and I opened the laptop back up and started working on it. And then she came out and said, well, they really can't do anything here. They said that I need to be tested, so I needed to go to the hospital. So I stopped again, took her to the hospital, and then she said, well, I'm probably going to be here for a while, so you might as well go home. So I went home, started working on it again, and every 2 minutes Gracie came in to tell me she had to go to the bathroom. And then Shelley called to tell me she was finished, so I stopped again and went back. So there's no telling what's in here this morning, and we're all going to find out together. So just have some grace with me if I say something that sounds off the wall. But I mentioned in Sunday school last week, so those of you who were in Sunday school would know about this. The other ones maybe not unless you've seen it on the news. But I talked about a popular Christian singer. He's been out for some time now, and his son passed away a few months ago from cardiac arrest. Now, his son had been wanting to follow in his dad's footsteps for some time. I had loosely followed his dad's music. It's not necessarily in the genre that I like, but I listened to some of them. And so I've actually heard his son in some of his older music, because when he was a kid, he would have him involved, and it was kind of cute type thing like that. And so his son was wanting to follow in his footsteps, and he had written a lot of music. And about a week before he died, he actually achieved the goal of having his first concert. So when I heard that he had passed away, I remember finding it strange that a 21-year-old male would die from cardiac arrest. When I heard this, I thought, well, that just sounds odd. But all they had at the time was that he died of cardiac arrest at home. Not that can't happen. It's just that it's very uncommon that you would see somebody that young die of something like that. But it wasn't until about a week and a half ago that the autopsy report was finally made public, and it was revealed that this young Christian singer had 3 different types of illegal drugs in his system that had caused an accidental overdose. Now, he didn't commit suicide, but apparently he had a problem with drugs, and he had mixed too many, which in turn caused the cardiac arrest that took his life. Now, this type of thing seems to be happening more and more often with people who claim to know Jesus Christ. I had breakfast with Roger Tickle, whom you all know. He's going to be speaking here next week. He spoke here once before. But I had breakfast with him just this past week, I think it was, and we were talking, and we kind of got on this subject, and he was telling me about somebody he knows that would drive a bus, and that people could hire this person to drive a bus for him, and this whoever this was had driven for several different Christian artists, including some well-known Southern gospel, different genres of Christian music. And this person was telling Roger that you wouldn't believe the type of things that he was seeing on these buses from these so-called Christians that were going to spread the gospel and to sing about the Lord. And he was seeing things like pornography and different things that they were talking about and things that were going on the bus. Now, the church is in such a mess overall that it actually does scare me. I mentioned this in Sunday school 2 weeks ago, or last week. Because, you see, we have people that are claiming to have the answers, and yet they seem to be just as diseased as the ones that they're going out saying, I have the answer for your affliction, which is Jesus Christ. It reminds me of the words that God used to describe the nation of Judah in the first chapter of Isaiah. Again, I brought this up last week. This was the country that was supposed to be dedicated to righteousness, dedicated to God. And yet God said of them, because of their behavior and how they were actually acting in comparison to how they should have been acting, he said, the whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it. Wounds, welts, and open sores. They haven't been closed, bandaged, or soothed with oil. So in other words, what God was saying is that they were totally diseased with sin from the top all the way to the bottom. That they weren't living the life that He expected of them. Now, I want to ask you a question this morning that I want you to try and define for yourself in your mind. Nobody has to shout out the answer. Just think about what it means to you. And the question is, what is religion? Now, depending on who you would ask that question to is going to determine what type of answer you're actually going to get. Because typically the word religion is frowned upon almost universally, whether outside of the church or inside of the church. Academically speaking, it could be referring to followers of Buddha just as much as it could be referring to followers of Christian, because religion could just mean any type of religion that someone follows. The liberal agnostic sees the word as representing a structured organization that is used by the elite as a form of control over the masses. And the church as a whole regularly uses the word as an insult that it can hurl towards competing denominations that observe different doctrines or practices than they do. In other words, they say, "You're religious, but I'm not." Or, "You're religious, but I have a relationship." I hear that a lot. In other words, you're beneath me because you only have religion, which I say is something fake, and I have God, which is something real, which is something totally different. In fact, I grew up in a denomination called the Church of God, and the word religion, or the term being religious, actually meant something very dirty to those people in that time, and probably actually still does. It might as well have been a four-letter word. And it certainly wasn't something that you wanted to be accused of. You did not want to be accused of being religious. It was considered shameful. It meant that you were either a Catholic or Methodist or some other form of liturgical Christianity that was more in love with tradition than you were in love with the relationship with the Almighty God. In fact, even today I still hear Christians say, with a lot of self-righteousness in their voices, how much they hate religion. And yet, even as a child, I struggled with the use of this word as a universal derogatory term. There's a reason why, because this word is in the Bible, which I'm going to get to here in a minute. But I struggled with it as a universal derogatory term, or as something that meant that someone else was actually at odds with God instead of in love with Him. Because just like how you can have a good man, believe it or not, who is a politician, and likewise you can also have an evil man who is a politician, and yet because there seem to be more bad men at times than good in politics, we tend to universally write off the whole lot as immoral without ever giving any individual politician an actual chance. To me, the same is true of the word religion and what it should actually represent. Because true religion stands in stark contrast to what we see the masses that we think are quote-unquote religious doing. In fact, one of my favorite books of the Bible addresses this very thing that I'm mentioning, and I'm sure you all know where I'm going when I get there. It actually gives the biblical definition for the word religion, and it's the book of James, chapter 1, verse 27. And James says there that pure religion and undefiled before our God and Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. In other words, religion in its purest form, or perhaps maybe a better way of phrasing it would be the true definition of what the word religion should mean for the Christian, is physically doing the work of the Lord and keeping yourself clean from sin at the same time. And everything else that gives religion a bad name. So those who are in love with tradition only, those who can't make the time to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ and show His mercy to this world, those who are hypocrites, those who worship other gods, and those who refuse to keep themselves unstained by the sins of this world and who just like living in their lifestyles, should all fall under the definition of not religion, but false religion. And I think that Christianity at large suffers from a very big problem of false religion as defined by the Bible. Now, it is of the difference between pure religion undefiled in Jesus Christ that James spoke of as defined in the Bible, and everything that means, and of false religion and everything that means and comes with that I actually want to speak on today. And I also, in this sermon, want to specifically focus on the second half of James's definition of religion in that scripture. Now, I've spent a lot of time recently talking about the first half. You see, James has categorized pure religion, as you can see with what I read to you, for us into really two questions that we can ask ourselves. And the first one being, are we being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ to this world? So are we showing compassion? Are we doing what He did to the loss of this world? And like I said, I've done a lot of sermons lately on that half of what James is talking about here in this definition. Last week my sermon was entitled, Who is the Faithful Servant? And the whole gist of the sermon was that it was about whether or not Christ was going to find us doing His work when He actually returns. But the second question that we should be asking ourselves after reading his definition of what religion is has to deal with a different aspect of the faith altogether, and one that modern Christianity seems to struggle with even more than being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. So the second question that we should ask ourselves is, am I allowing myself to be cleansed by Christ? And am I remaining in that purification? Have I truly touched Him? And with that, I'm going to go to my text for this morning, which I'm going to be in the book of Mark if you want to follow along, chapter 5. And I'm going to read verses 24 through 34. And it says, He went with him, and a great multitude followed him, and they pressed upon him on all sides. A certain woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things by many physicians, had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. Having heard the things concerning Jesus, came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his clothes. For she said, If I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, Who touched my clothes? The disciples' response here always kind of cracks me up. His disciples said to him, You see the multitude pressing against you, and you say, Who touched me? He looked around to see her who had done this thing, but the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had been done to her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be cured of your disease. Now, I chose Mark's recounting of this story over Matthew's this morning for a reason. And that's because Mark feels the need to tell a more complete version of this account than Matthew did. Mark saw something else that Matthew apparently didn't see or didn't quite think was as important to recount. You see, Mark didn't want to just convey that Jesus had healed this woman who touched him and then leave the story abruptly there as just another of the many acts of kindness that Christ had performed when he walked this earth. Instead, Mark feels the need to let the reader understand that there is much more going on here than just another healing, which we see Jesus doing all through the Gospels. Because this time, things are a little different. You see, Mark tells us that when Jesus feels that this woman has been healed through touching him, that he makes a point to stop and to turn around and then make a public spectacle out of what just happened. He wanted everybody to see. He wanted everybody to hear what was going on. Yet at the same time, Christ doesn't just point to this woman and call her out by name either. Instead, he invites her to confess what she did publicly by saying, Who touched me? Now, the text indicates that the disciples thought that this was a ridiculous question, which is why it I find it humorous when I read that. The disciples were amazed that he asked this. They said, Master, you're walking through a multitude of people that are brushing up and pressing against you from all angles, and yet you publicly turn around and ask, Who touched me? In case you haven't noticed, Lord, you're sort of a celebrity. You've been walking around healing people. And we're walking through this great multitude of people who are here to see you, that want to see you, that want you to touch them. The fact of the matter is, everyone has touched you. I've touched you. Peter's touched you. Thomas has touched you. The tax collector over there touched you. Those little children over there by that barn with the sticky fingers touched you, and I think they might have left a stain on your robe. The smelly guy that's been following us for the past 3 weeks, he touched you. Even the donkeys and the camels have brushed up against you at some point or another. So, Lord, could you be a little more specific as to why you're asking, Who touched me? But you see, the text implies that this was unusual, even to the disciples. But Jesus wasn't looking for someone who had just accidentally brushed up against him. Somebody grabbed him intentionally, and he wanted to draw everyone's attention to what had happened. And the next part of this set of scriptures is very telling of why Jesus asked this question. Because you see, it says, He looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, she's fearing and trembling, knowing what had been done to her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. I'm pointing out here that she's fearing and trembling, and she's coming down and falling before him. Now again, I want to pause right there for a minute and examine this, because most of the time in the New Testament, when Jesus healed someone, the Bible describes the person as being absolutely overjoyed that Christ had made them whole. In fact, they usually would jump up and give God glory, and then they would run around and tell others what had happened to them. But as we've determined, Mark paints an entirely different picture here in this gospel by adding what actually happened after Jesus turns around. So this was no ordinary healing. This woman touched Christ in secret for a reason. She was then healed, and then he calls her out publicly, again for a reason, in front of all the disciples and the entire crowd of people to confess what she had did. And Mark says that she comes before him not jumping for joy, but trembling, almost like a child that's headed to the principal's office to get some sort of punishment. You see, this woman was afraid because even though this may seem like a very simple story to us in 21st century America, in first century Judea, this was actually a very big deal, what she had just done. Because when she touched Jesus, she actually broke the law. It was the law of Moses, which all the Jews had to abide by, and it was broken by her act. Specifically in Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 through 27, which outlines a woman in this woman's specific physical condition and refers to her as unclean. And according to that same law, whomever came into any type of contact with her or her belongings, they didn't even necessarily have to touch her, even by accident became unclean right along with her. So there was a lot of different restrictions for people in this type of situation that she had. But these two people did not just accidentally touch. The Bible tells us this woman intentionally sought out Christ in her affliction, knowing that she was going to break the law. And in her physical uncleanness, as determined by the law of Moses, she touched this man anyways. And by touching Jesus, according to the law, she should have made him unclean also. Which is why when he called her out, she came to him trembling, fearful for what was about to happen, expecting to be punished as a lawbreaker in front of everyone that she knew, that Jesus was going to call her out in front of everyone. And so she comes to him on her hands and knees, trembling, ashamed of what she had done. But you see, Mark put Christ's reaction in this story so that everyone, Jewish and Gentile readers alike who read his words, would see that the reverse actually took place in this story. Jesus didn't condemn the woman. And instead of making Christ unclean by touching him, Mark tells us that Jesus cleansed her. So you see, this story is the great analogy of our faith. If you could pick one story out of the Bible that accurately represents what Christ can do for you, this would be the story that I would suggest. Because no matter how filthy or dirty you are, spiritually speaking, no matter what your sinful affliction is, Christ bore your uncleanness for you on the cross, and he put it to death. And when you willingly come to touch him, instead of making him dirty, you are cured from the scourge of sin, because he was dirty up on the cross. Everything that the law says that makes you impure is removed entirely. Your condemnation is wiped out and you become clean before God. But you see, one of the biggest problems with Christianity today is that we don't have the heart of this woman. And I want you to follow me with this. I mean, this woman wanted to be clean. She wanted to not be considered unclean and have to stay away from people and have this affliction and this shame on her life. And she wanted to be clean so bad that she was willing to break the law of Moses and to suffer the punishment and the ridicule of men, all just to go and touch Jesus Christ. And yet Christians today seem to be the opposite, because we push his righteousness as far away from us as possible, and we justify our behavior. And we say we don't want to change. We defiantly rejoice in our spiritual uncleanness, and we revel in the lifestyles that are contrary to what the Bible teaches us that we should be living. Now, we want to claim that we are saved and going to heaven. We'll go to church, and we'll even tell people that we know Jesus, that we've asked him into our hearts, whatever that means by today's standards, because it means many different things to different people. But our lifestyles prove that we are still walking around in our impurity, unable to be healed by the physicians of this world, and spending all of our money and suffering many things, as the Bible says of this woman, never once even desiring that spiritual cleansing in the first place that naturally comes from actually touching Christ, because you can't touch him, actually touch him and walk away impure. And this is exactly why we have Christian artists addicted to illegal drugs. and dying at the age of 21. It's why we have people who claim Christ yet can't escape the hold of alcoholism. It's why we have men in the church molesting little children throughout the week in the church office and then preaching sermon from the pulpit on Sunday morning. It's why Christians are always power struggling with each other inside of the local churches. It's why so-called Christians have some of the foulest mouths and tell some of the dirtiest jokes. It's why we have denominations splitting over homosexuality going on inside the church with people who are claiming to be Christians. It's why the divorce rates are so ridiculously high among Christians. And it's why Christians are perceived as the worst customers at restaurants on Sunday afternoons. And don't think that we aren't, because we are. They complain about us all the time because of their foul attitudes and their poor treatment of the staff when they go to these restaurants. Because we have a lot of men and women who say that they know Jesus, but who have never actually crawled on the ground through the crowd on their hands and knees and risked the possibility of public scrutiny to actually come to the Son of God and touch the hem of His garment to be cleansed from the affliction of sin that we all suffer from. You see, the church today has a lot of men and women who are Christian in name only because they don't even slightly resemble James's definition of pure religion, undefiled, that I mentioned earlier. There is a lot of false religion in Christianity today. Nobody can dispute that. Even the world sees it. And they laugh at us. The church is an absolute disaster, and I fear for it. The whole head is sick, like God said in Isaiah chapter 1. It's diseased from top all the way to the bottom. But religion itself is not a dirty word. In fact, pure religion, undefiled, is a beautiful thing in the sight of God our Father. Because pure religion, undefiled, comes from someone who has touched Christ. And in place of selfishness has chosen a life of selflessness and mercy towards others. And in place of the many sins that have kept us separated from the Father, has accepted instead a spiritual cleansing and an innocence that comes from touching Jesus Christ. So that when we are called out by the Son of God in front of the crowds, we don't have to receive our condemnation for breaking the law. Instead, we receive our commendation for our faith in what He has already done for us on the cross. So my friends, in closing, what I would say is that pure religion undefiled is a life that has been totally transformed by touching Christ. And pure religion undefiled is what the church needs more than ever today. It's what we all need individually. So don't be afraid to be called religious if you're in that pure religion undefiled. Our closing hymn this morning will be number 303.